Thank you. And I would like to welcome everyone to today's meeting. I know that we have some of you returning from the Unit 1 and some of you who may be new with us today. So welcome all, and I hope that you gain what you are looking for from today's event. Thank you very much, Ellie, for the support on the technical issues. Hopefully everyone has been sent their materials, and then there are the additional materials of Script A and Script B available in the resources area of the Zoom room. Today we're looking principally at delivery of paper 2. We will begin with an overview of the paper and then move on into looking at the specifics of this unit. Just to give you an overview of the timings, it will be a 2-hour event. What we will tend to do is we will give you an opportunity for a well-being break just shortly after the halfway point. So 5 or 10 minutes after the first hour, there will be a reading activity and there will be some time allowed if you need to step away to have that well-being break. So that will be there for you as well. Welcome again, and we shall make our starts and see sort of how we are working through. So I hope today is what you are looking for. With this training, we are hoping to achieve a number of aims. We will be looking at aspects of the assessment objectives, particularly relating to Unit 2. We'll be working with some questions from the paper, and we will be thinking about how the question can be addressed using performance criteria and thinking about how those assessment objectives are met in responding to questions. We'll think about previous work from students in past units. And we'll look at strategies for teaching to make sure that questions can be accessed to target those objectives. And hopefully within chat, there will be an opportunity to share your ideas with other teachers. So hopefully that will be something that you will be able to do today. If your screen is still blank, hopefully the slideshow is now loading. It can take a moment to appear. It should be sharing with you now. If I can just check, yes, Ellie's just responded to you there. If you log back in, you hopefully should be able to see that screen. So that's a little bit of a Zoom issue, and hopefully it's quickly resolved. I'll just quickly check with that one as well. Perfect. I hope to see you soon, Sonara. So we will be trying to share our practice through the chat function, and we'll also be looking closely at the wording and phrasing of the questions and how we can unpick those to help our candidates. So welcome to Pearson. We do have our facts and figures here about the sense that we have sort of assessing examinations across a wide area with a number of students, both UK and globally. Just working with our general information, we know that our A level builds on GCSE or GCSE, but also the candidates come from other qualifications. We're blending the knowledge and skills. It's an integrated course, so we're looking at integrating skills and holistic marking. And we know that some of you have been taking your examinations this week, and there are options to work through modularly or at the end of the 2 years. So it can be a very flexible qualification in terms of approach. Those who are joining us again have worked with the Unit 1 activity on post-2000 poetry and prose, and then today we'll be mostly focused in on Unit 2 drama. There will be upcoming sessions on Unit 3 poetry and prose and the Shakespeare and the pre-1900 poetry in the coming weeks. Just a quick point looking at our weightings across the 2 qualifications, and we can see there that our lion's share is still predominantly AO1 and AO2, though we will be looking at various questions and how we maybe need to address aspects of AO3 and AO5. Looking at Unit 2 today, we'll not be discussing AO4 because we don't have a comparative element in this unit. But moving across the unit itself, we have there an equal distribution of AO1 and AO2, and then that slightly heavier weighting on our context and on our critical interpretations at AO3 and AO5. So a quick summary there of what we've just said. So we're thinking about our assessment objectives, and they are designed to be common to ourselves and across other qualifications to ensure parity and fairness for candidates, and that the subject domain or our constructs are tested appropriately. And therefore, we would get validity in terms of attainment and reference point, both for teachers and candidates and assessors as well. So today we are looking at Unit 2 drama. I'll just quickly check that chat to check that no one's sort of lost. Wonderful, Sonara. Great to hear. So I'm glad that everything's sorted for you now. So drama, let's remind ourselves, it is an open book exam, 2 hours. Candidates should bring in the clean copies. We have our two sections with equal weighting, 25 marks for A, 25 marks for B. In section A, which we'll spend most of the first hour on, we're looking at the specified pre-1900 texts, and we have our choices there. So in terms of some of the questions we'll look at today, Othello still predominates, it's still a very popular choice, but we are seeing interest and we are seeing centres working through with the other texts. So it's good to see some Faustus and Rover and a bit of Goldsmith popping in there as well. There are two questions available on each text, and the candidate will choose one, and the examples will follow as we work through the slides. Section B, similar format, but we're looking at post-1900. So we have Raisin in the Sun, Streetcar Named Desire, which still sort of predominates, Death of Salesman, Top Girls, and Waiting for Godot. So having a look, we're going to focus in for the first activity on 3 questions taken from Othello. And we're going to think as we work through or reflect upon the idea, not so much just what question we'd have chosen to do, but how we can use the 2 parts of the prompt. So there is sort of format where we have a prompting statement, and then we work through with the task itself. And we think about, with candidates, how we could use the questions as an assessment for learning activity. And these questions are things that we can ask students as well as ourselves. The best way to begin a response, thinking then also an end point. So if we're thinking about signposting our views, where were we going to? What is the journey? We can compare our choices in a moment once we get going, and we'll have a look at that as well. Just taking a look through. Yes, Twelfth Night did come up. And now you don't worry, it was on the pre-1900 list, so we haven't forgotten about Twelfth Night. It is there, and there will sort of be the opportunities possibly to look at those questions. As I say, in terms of the activity, we're going to start with some Othello because we're thinking about skills and approaches, and obviously these can apply to any of the set texts. We're looking more at how to guide students in answering these questions and sort of working through these questions. Okay, no problem. I just didn't want you to bother with that there. Wonderful. Okay, so we have this structure with all of the texts. So we will have a statement. It's there to guide students and maybe give them a little bit of a step on the way. So if we think of that statement as something just to kind of prompt their critical thinking and prompt them into a critical position. The question itself, the task itself, begins at in the light of this statement. So in terms of how candidates are sort of being expected to use the question, the prompt gives them some ideas to evaluate, some ideas to consider, that sense of to what extent. And then the task itself reminds them that we're focusing on a dramatist craft. And that idea of dramatic presentation, it's kind of the how it's done, and then also their critical position. So if we take the one that we're looking at right now, we have a number of ingredients or concepts that we could address in the statement. So we're not just simply maybe saying that there is a difference in presentation of gender, but we have a comment about the perceived intelligence and strength of the women and how that comes across in dramatic presentation. And then this comment that students can take a position for or against or to a certain degree, the sense that the men foolishly underestimate the intelligence and strength of women. So it gives them something to sort of peg their ideas to, if you like. They don't have to strictly follow this statement. They are being asked to explore relationships between men and women in its broader sense as well. But it really does just give them a thinking point or a starting point for developing their own thesis. So it's suggesting that they might want to consider moments where the female characters demonstrate that intelligence or strength, and then that sense of where do we see that underestimation, or if which is perfectly valid, a candidate feels that this is not the case, they can sort of develop and present their own thesis in terms of talking about relationships between men and women. So we mustn't feel too constricted by the statement. It's there to help. But equally, if a candidate's very confident that they can explore a range of facets of the relationships between men and women, by all means, carry on as you are, sort of thing. So don't feel that they can just simply restrict themselves to sort of those terms. But the terms are certainly something to hook into and work through. And similarly, we can see we have the exact same format in the alternative choice, and the sense of dealing with what is innocence, what is guilt, and betrayal or portrayals of betrayal in Othello. And depending on where the student accesses this, we could maybe look at those more major betrayals and how they drive forward or the narrative function, or we can look at maybe elements that affect the minor characters and work through and explore in various ways. So it's the sense that there's no one right approach. It's looking for the candidate's critical engagement and sort of seeing what they do with the questions. And here we do have sort of a question where we're really closely focusing in on narrative function, and it's sort of the narrative role or the dramatic function of Cassio as a character. So we're being invited to say he's more than just that plot device, but also illuminating key ideas of the play. So here the student has room to really explore and really present their views on Cassio and how he links to key themes, and then also really guiding them towards maybe talking about dramatic function, character type, and even the structure of the tragedy. So there's room there for candidates to come at that question in a series of ways. So we're always trying to get students to think about what is the playwright doing? How are they presenting? Or if it is a case of looking at dialogue, for example, how is that being crafted? Where are we seeing patterns? And where are we seeing that evidence of the dramatist at work in the case of dramatic texts? Certainly, we'll look at characterization. So, how are these characters portrayed to us through language, through action, through maybe how they are presented within a particular setting? The form and structure. So, many texts were thinking about tragic form and how that actually illuminates the audience's understanding. Most texts will deal with the sense of the imagery and the symbols and the motifs, and students have freedom there sort of to explore where they believe those symbols sort of have that dramatic function. Language choices are key, they are still important, but we would encourage candidates not to become too focused on a sort of a word level. By all means, they can select some examples that illustrate a pattern or the theme or motif, but the sense of the play working as a whole can be quite effective. And the play is play. I know it sounds quite obvious, but with Unit 2, it's this sense that this is a piece designed to be performed, where appropriate, and maybe in Shakespeare it is more implicit, but certainly in some of the other texts, we may be looking at the sense of how the staging is influencing or supporting the message. And thinking about the form and how it helps you understand and analyze meaning and potential conflicts. We don't need it to be sort of a historical essay, but the sense that, the audience of the time may be interpreting the text in particular ways, and ourselves as modern audience may also be interpreting these scenes, these characters in particular ways. How the candidate responds themselves personally, but with the idea of supporting it with evidence from the text. That sense of signposting and constructing the critical argument. By all means, candidates sort of are invited to engage with that primary steer, but equally there are candidates who are quite confident and sort of range beyond it and sort of can construct sort of their own thesis, their own arguments. Yes, the sense of the dramatic techniques and methods, it is key. And in fact, Mark, you've kind of just stepped ahead a little because we are about to sort of discuss this idea of what counts and what we can sort of include for that. So the sense that we do have the context element and the idea of actually the staging being used in two possible ways. Possibly falls under context in terms of context of initial reception for audience, but it can also be used to inform what we would call our critical interpretation AO5. So we may actually look to one specific performance and think that actually that is a sign of a director making an interpretation and sort of taking a particular meaning from the words from the dramatic text. So on sort of, as Mark said, this idea of staging being key, being central, not every centre does have the possibility of seeing these texts live. And it is the point that the film or television adaptation or version of performance is wholly acceptable in terms of, if we are obviously using it to show moments of dramatic presentation or as we said, using it for critical interpretation. So the sense that the staging can become an interpretation, which the candidate in turn can present their evaluation of. So we're taking that step where we're maybe doing more than just describing an element of a particular adaptation, but we're thinking about how that illuminates a particular message that the playwright may be trying to get across. So this idea of sort of using that staging as potential AO5, so using it as a version or a critical interpretation, the sort of page to stage, if you like. And some candidates do actually quite confidently include multiple examples. So they include examples from more than one performance. But it would be fine, as you say, to sort of work with one and explore it and explore the nuance. So it does suggest this word pertinent. So as we said, the reason we want candidates to think about those performances they've seen as moving towards AO5 more than possibly AO3 at times is the sense of how it supports a particular critical view. So by all means, we can use it partially for AO3 context, and we can say that it illustrates an aspect of the text in its time, but it can be more interesting and maybe more critically evaluative to think about that performance they've seen or an aspect of that performance and think about it in terms of that is an interpretation. So this point of what does it bring out in terms of either themes or concerns of the text. And that's sort of where we think those students who achieve in level 5, they're doing that quite confidently and quite naturally, actually. They've become engaged in versions that they've seen during the course of their learning, and they're able to sort of discuss those in very meaningful ways. So they can bring up not just sort of the language from the script, but they can talk about how they've sort of seen that performance and what it has illustrated for them. So coming on to this idea, and not so much about front loading as such, but if we do think about that use of performance, and in terms of in the chat box, do centres, for example, make use of students themselves, candidates themselves, producing performances of excerpts or extracts? If we're using those televised performances, or even if we've sort of been to see a live performance, where are they being implemented? Are candidates mainly using them for AO3 or AO5? In terms of getting that idea of the page to stage across, has anyone sort of developed, or would anyone sort of suggest effective ways that they've been doing that with their students? So we'll have just a moment or two, and if you would like to just sort of place your comments into the chat box so that we can have sort of a shared moment, thinking about performances, either seen or sort of referred to, even if they have to sort of look at a reference to a famous performance, and how do you feel your candidates are making use of those at the moment? Would you say they're sort of predominantly using them in sort of an AO3 context fashion, to give us a sense of society or history? Or are they maybe using it for AO3, but more to do with audience reception? Or if they are sort of making use of their performed texts as AO5, what sort of use are they making of it? Are they purely looking at language, or have they been considering things like costume and unusual staging, or sort of innovative interpretations? So I'll just give everyone a moment or two, and if you'd like to just, if everyone could just maybe make one contribution onto the chat box, and we'll just see if there's this variety of approaches that centres would be taking. So we're thinking of, do you use performed versions often? Are you using multiple versions of your particular text? I know for some of you, it's harder to get your hands on sort of variations of your text. There may be less versions of Raisin in the Sun, when we're looking at the post 1900. But what have we been doing with other performances? Have we been going to live performance, using multiple versions, and what have the students been doing with it? So if I just give everyone a moment, and if you want to just add a thought into chat, and we'll share the chat. And we're getting some really nice examples here. So some good shared practice, particular versions that seem to work well. Yeah, the streaming of the digital theatre is really useful now, isn't it? It's one of the upsides of all the issues that we did have with COVID. Being able to get live theatre on stream can be really helpful, can't it? Oh, hi, Kirsty. I'll try and keep that in mind. Yeah, Faustus, the context coming through performance may be important for those candidates, mightn't it, with the idea of the frameworks in terms of belief systems. So yes, the performance may sort of help bring those out to the students. Have we got just as people are adding their comments, have you sort of had experience of some of your students using the performance effectively to address AO5? This idea that actually, as well as giving us some context, it can give us a sense of um, ways of approaching, critical interpretations. And yes, we've got some advice there. Anyone doing 12th night? So thank you all those who are sort of suggesting particular performances. Sometimes it can be a little gem that someone's overlooked. Clips, yeah, the idea of actually that compare contrast of different clips, it can really hone students' skills in terms of evaluating what that directorial choice has sort of shown or illuminated about a particular character. Yeah, the interpretation clip. Yes, so the sense of looking at critically what is sort of the director bringing out. And sometimes, we're not sort of over laboring it, but it is that idea that, on one hand, we're saying we're going to be clear what we mean for AO3, what we mean for AO5, but it's the fact that actually we can use that resource and we can develop responses to both of those AOs depending on the task that we set. So we can sort of ask those students to sort of have a look at um, the context or how it illuminates it, but we can also take those smaller clips and we can think about how would that aid a critical interpretation. Yes, and the sense of the actors interpreting and also this sense of the different versions, sometimes a particular version you've mentioned there with the glass walls and the emotional turmoil in Streetcar, it is the sense that that staging can bring that element, can bring particular themes to light and can really sort of help sharpen a student's understanding of that characterization, and how, in that example, which we may look at later, how Williams sort of uses his plastic theatre to present another way of telling that story. Yes, so thank you so much for everyone sort of getting on board and bringing through so many sort of useful examples there. And it is that sense, isn't it? It's the idea of being able to be flexible with these forms of resources that we have, and that idea of getting it off that page, getting the candidates aware that this is a different genre, isn't it? Some notes back, we always have issues with planning with units, obviously keep the planning in mind. The sense of looking at questions and looking at working with the question and the mark scheme with candidates as well. So we have our statement, despite their love for each other, Othello and Desdemona's relationship was always destined to fail. And then our typical, the task itself, in the light of this statement, explore Shakespeare's presentation of Othello and Desdemona's relationship. And there's things that candidates can unpick. So we have at one level this sense of, portrayal of love and the portrayal of the relationship. But this sense of the destined to fail, it brings in our sense of fate. It brings in the idea of the genre. So to what extent, where are the tragic aspects and where are those moments where we know that this story is sort of leading to an inexorable fate. So we have a sense that this would guide candidates in one aspect. And also, you may even see a candidate sort of working to a degree against this. So we may say a candidate suggesting that there are flaws in this, and there are sort of maybe, we have sometimes candidates discussing Othello's view of love and how that maybe sort of leads to or precipitates some elements of the tragedy. And things that we could do. We have the mark schemes, and often they may sit and we sort of look at them ourselves and maybe use them in mock moments, but taking extracts from mark schemes and using them with our students as a form of a revision aid. So we always say that, that mark scheme, it's just a guidance. We accept any sort of answer that sort of shows value, but we can show those schemes to candidates. We can show these sort of indicative content, and we can ask them what they would add to or what improvement they would make, or if there were aspects that they'd not sort of been looking at before. So it's not sort of setting out to trick the candidates, it's sort of saying, here's some suggested points that we might expect. And the fact that it's not sort of exhaustive on one sense, there are many other points that a candidate could draw out. But equally, they wouldn't be expected to cover everything on the indicative list either. Candidates' approaches are quite individual. So it's using an indicative content for a particular question and getting the students to sort of really engage with the actual mark scheme in sort of a critical fashion, working out and honestly evaluating if there were certain aspects that they maybe hadn't considered. And then equally giving them a chance of saying, well, I would do it this way. I think this needs to be explored, and allowing them to sort of develop the confidence to do that and say that. The fact that the mark scheme is sort of a work in progress almost. And they can use this in different ways. They may sort of put their own plans onto some flashcards and use them later. So you can actually maybe use a section of a session to begin the revision that you hope they will do independently in future weeks. And then the sense of maybe taking a plan and adding some textual reference, because obviously those are designed for sort of assessors and teachers, and they don't sort of have those references on them. Or even the idea of make your own questions, that can work quite well sometimes. So we ask them to look at it and say, could you design a further linked question? So if we take this one and looking at some of the things that we may have seen or expected to see, you have that idea of, obviously it's asking about the relationship, and some candidates may look at diction and dialogue, the sense of the imagery and how it's employed throughout. And candidates are usually quite good at that. They might look at any sort of militaristic image, and they might look at sort of imagery of ownership, for example, and the sense of being commodified. You then have dramatic aspects, dramatic presentations. So candidates are usually pretty good in their discussion or their work with the handkerchief, and the sense of contrast and potential ironies that emerge. Structurally, we can look at particular dramatic techniques or even the bigger picture, the idea of particular moments within the tragic downfall. And then possible critical responses. It will depend on sort of who the candidates have been reading. We can work with sort of academic critics, and as we said before, we can even bring in those versions that we've seen performed. So we can work through both more sort of formal academic criticism and then also looking at that play in itself. And ask the students to be, happy to improve, add to, and sort of add some references if they wish. One thing that you might say, a deliberate omission, is that there maybe isn't an AO3 coverage in there. So see if they sort of would add something useful there and see what they'd put in for AO3. And how could they address it? So in that case, that scheme looked at a few dramatic features. It looked at one critic. And if we had to say, or if we went to our students and thought about AO3, in terms of the idea of their relationship, the deliberate omission of AO3 coverage, what types of things could we encourage students to look at? So the sense of it being doomed to fail, and the more general question, which was the presentation of their relationship. So what type of AO3 might we anticipate our students including? If you don't do Othello, do obviously just feel free to put your examples in from the set text that you've chosen to study. So say, for example, if you're looking at Twelfth Night, if you're thinking about relationships or protagonists or key figures, again, if you ask yourself a similar question, AO3 coverage. If we're looking at Faustus, we can look at possibly, sort of his relationship, in terms of, either Mephistopheles, or we can sort of look out to, if you want to look at the idea of the ideal, the idea of the Helen. So AO3, what could we suggest to students? So it could be quite broad because we're still looking at a plan, but what one or maybe two things possibly would improve an answer with a focus on AO3. So we're working with Othello, but if you're working with another text, thinking about a key relationship in your set text. So the patriarchy, so the sense of this relationship operating within that structure. I don't know if we have any Goldsmith out there, but we'd be really keen to hear if we've got any. So if we're doing any of the other texts, yes, the sense of and certainly in terms of how our modern sort of interpretations would go, and then also contextually, if we think of Elizabeth and the laws that she was bringing in, restricting various groups, and possibly that idea. We can also look at the sense of how, Othello sort of is proving his worth, and then how that maybe impacts his sort of relationship, and the idea of status and commodification. Obviously, it is an Othello question. If those of you who are maybe not doing Othello for pre-1900, if you want to pop in with a possible AO3 for the text that you're studying. Yeah, so Iago's manipulation with this idea, and that role of that minority, isn't it? That idea of how the power is being used and being exploited, and you have different characters who inhabit sort of different points within society, and how that changes depending on how they're being evaluated. We could even, I suppose, bring in, Brabantio, and the idea of, the sense of the woman, passing, from being daughter to wife and so on. We can look at how that would have been impacted by context. With, say, we know we have a few Twelfth Nights out there. If we're thinking about central relationships there, is there anything we would add with that text? Yes, this idea of Iago as that, that malcontent character who's perfectly been enabled to do this, isn't he? Yes, Malvolio and our Puritans in the contemporary drama, and the sense of, yeah, Viola, we sort of explore the sense of Viola's freedom, so to speak, when she takes on her disguise. A call out to anyone doing the lesser covered text. So if anyone's sort of brave enough to put in an AO3 for any of the remaining texts. So if we're looking at Faustus, thank you, Bradley. So we've got Faustus and our Reformation and his beliefs. And interestingly, we have the aspect of religion with Faustus, and then this key idea of his relationship with God in lots of different ways, in terms of how he believes himself superior at certain times, and the sense that yes, morality plays as well, and how that feeds into it. The audience would have been aware of those types of texts, and they would have been drawing on the knowledge of that, and that would help and aid their understanding of the staging in particular. Okay, so thank you. I'll not sort of torture people any longer, but we will sort of look as well. There are some examples of some of the other texts, some resources and work on the website as well, if anyone wants to sort of pursue that a little bit further. with that sense. Thinking about language, and interestingly with that plan, and we're not afraid of sort of criticizing the so-called indicative content because we often sort of draft that as a set of ideas that candidates might cover. There is a sense that maybe one or two of those bullets could actually have been conflated and used actually to address context. So that would be a good lesson actually for candidates as well. You know, occasionally they might separate some points that could actually be dealt with more holistically and actually make a point about context or staging. Um, so that's a thing you could do with a student as well. We could take a point that appears to be focusing on language, diction, dialogue, and we would ask them to develop or improve it so it has more clear reference to our AO3. So the sense of that. And again, this idea that, you know, we're going to look more further at AO5 when we're looking at the post 1900. But this idea that we're trying to get across with both AO3 and AO5 that we don't need to have this kind of the Marxist critic says approach. You know, we can actually see the students' critical interpretation developing through the way that they're actually using the critics that they've come across and using that work. So we have a few points that candidates may have brought in. We talked, you know, we mentioned, some of you mentioned patriarchy as well, and maybe bringing her father in particular. That idea of that foreshadowing, you know, she's deceived her father and may thee. So the sense of does that fit in with the tragic fall? You've written, I think, about Iago and the sense of those prejudices. And I like that point you made, Mark, that, you know, Iago is enabled by the society that he lives in to behave in this way. And in fact, he's invited to, and we can look at that fact that that's soliloquy, you know, he's addressing us as the audience in the early stages of the play, and he's taking that pleasure in his plans. Handkerchief, as we say, they tend to enjoy and work with quite well. And then, yes, those elements about that intertwining, that interaction, what we'd call maybe intersectionality of racism, misogyny. I'll not claim that. That's Kieran Ryan as a critic, but, you know, he's got the three there, hasn't he? Racism, misogyny, and motiveless malignity. So the sense that actually the society is sort of drawing that web around them even before Iago commits the crimes that he commits. A question that gives maybe a more open-ended approach. This sense desire is a destructive force. So it gives candidates a little bit to play with, a little bit to work with. Presentation of desire in its various formats. And we have these key steers that you might give the student and ask them to kind of finish, you know, complete these dots. And I think if you're thinking that they really must stay with AO3, just give them those two bullets, you know, so a first focus and a second focus. See, can they draw out, you know, sort of two separate points on that, so to make sure that those objectives are being hit. And the key thing that we'll note is that taking desire in all its forms, that's going to help them get there, isn't it? So there's nothing wrong with a candidate focusing on that physical or sexual desire and solely, if they do it with nuance and if they really sort of interrogate it. But we find that candidates who often achieve the level 5 here, they're thinking about the different forms of desire, and that will bring obviously Iago in terms of what is it does he desire and so on. So thinking about things not to do now, just as we sort of wrap this section, it's candidates do like the security of it, but it's this idea of if they can avoid the pre-prepared section. Obviously, there's things that we do want them to include. We do want them to show an awareness of where these plays are from in terms of time and place, but it's the relevance, isn't it? So if they can work it in a meaningful way, rather than having sort of a stock intro. And we see less of that these days, but I think students do sometimes do it as a little bit of a security blanket. So if we can sort of get them to be confident and avoid taking that approach, and maybe taking an approach where the opening sentence states a claim. You know, they've thought about the question and they've got a viewpoint, they've got a thesis that they're then going to explore. And then by all means, further down in the paragraph, they can sort of show an awareness that this text is from a particular time and place, but it's trying to avoid that sort of set paragraph that sort of sets them off sometimes on the wrong footing. The AO5, sorry, Bianca, it did just say in that slide we're going to be dealing with AO5 more extensively in part two. So we will be looking at the idea of interpretations. While we're here just for now, you can, if you wish, you can sort of produce a sort of short anthology or extracts from particular interpretations and ask them to work actively with them. Ask them to evaluate the evaluation, if you like, and maybe ask them to compare and contrast, differing critical opinions. And there will be, so hopefully we'll do that activity where we ask everyone to sort of share their ideas. But it is the sense that there are those ways that we can get them to do it actively. Often we set readings and we hope for the best, and some students will. They will religiously sort of pursue sort of wide reading. And sometimes we need to give them a little bit of a helping hand, so we do need to sort of guide them a little bit more. So looking at Othello and desire as a destructive force, that's no problem, don't worry about that. And then AO3, yes, we've got social structures, power, attitudes to women and sex. Yes, absolutely, for that point with the AO3. And it's that sense, isn't it? It's getting candidates to sort of discuss it even, before they get into sort of planning the answer in that finer detail. And interleaving, as we say, or integrating, it's a key aspect of candidates who are operating at that higher level 4 and into that level 5. If they can work it in, we won't say seamlessly, that's sort of quite high demand, but if we're sort of saying that they're working it in meaningful ways, if they can bring that context in to expand upon a point or to really reiterate or refine an argument that they're making, that's sort of our best use of the AO3. So it's not sort of sitting separate in its own paragraph, it's coming across throughout the response. And as we said, if they're targeting maybe 2 areas at least, then they're sort of thinking about how this plays into the wider arguments. And yeah, the examiner's report did say this idea that the best answers were sort of flexible about what they meant about desire. So some good answers on Othello's actual desire is acceptance, some really nice, thoughtful responses. Some felt actually, that overpowers any love that he may feel for Desdemona, and that therefore sort of guides him towards his ultimate downfall. Um, they looked, some students really looked well at those characters, Cassio, Rodrigo as well. So the sense that, looking at those other characters and where they fit in terms of dramatic function and sort of where they fit in terms of expanding the themes of the play. We mentioned this. It's not impossible to have scored a level 5 just with that maybe more surface level version of desire, but it might limit, it will possibly limit a student to sort of focusing in on one aspect of the text. And it wasn't mentioned here, but we do see some good answers where candidates try to explore, Iago's desire. What is it that he wants? When we say context and what we want and what we need to do, it can be genre. So it can just be having a clear awareness of how the texts operate in the case of most of them as tragedies, where you have maybe the idea of Twelfth Night, then you may be looking at some tragic comic elements. We don't need a full history of tragedy, so we don't need sort of where it comes from and a sort of an overarching historical journey, but a sense that we know aspects of tragedy and we know maybe how then the playwright is working to that model. Comedy we sometimes find maybe a little bit trickier, but the idea then of where that comedy lies and what an audience may be expecting or not expecting in terms of sort of a comic relief for those texts that have comic elements. Relevant sources, number of you have mentioned this morning that idea of those wider social contexts. If Faustus, it might be religion. Culturally, it can be that inbuilt racial difference or misogyny or patriarchy and how that's presented at the time. Okay, for now, we will turn our attention to the longer activity. So we're here actually a little bit ahead of half, and we should sort of get ourselves through to our well-being break more or less, and maybe a little bit early. We'll have hopefully in the materials that were sent to you a mark scheme. If not, I think there's the 2406 mark scheme on the resources section at the three dots in Zoom. You're most interested in the marking grid. So we're not looking at the indicative contact boxes for now. We're looking at that marking grid and we're looking at sort of levels of performance. And the way that we approach it, if we read an essay for the first time, we might have that first impression. So we might be thinking about those headline words. Lower down the performance grid, we're thinking, is this work merely general? And when we're building towards level 3, are we beginning to see work that is clear and relevant? When we're building towards 4, we're thinking about, is this work controlled? Does this work have a level of distinction or discrimination? Is it beginning to sort of pick out examples in a meaningful way? And then as we're moving to that level 5, we're thinking about that idea of this critical evaluation and that critical engagement. It's sort of moving throughout the candidate's answer pretty much the whole way through. Although we do get examples of students that kind of begin in that level 4 and then they build, they get themselves to that level 5 by the end of the response. They get the teeth in sort of halfway through. So we don't have to be at the 5 the whole way through, but we can see a student that might announce themselves if they're sort of critically evaluative from the very first paragraph. But we think about those headlines first. And then if we're trying to hone our mark and think about where in a level a student might be, we're looking at the bullets and we're thinking about, to what extent do we feel that they've met all of these, in which case we're looking at the top. Is an answer a little bit insecure? If an answer we feel has some elements of the level below, are we saying there's still enough to get into the lower edge of the second level? So is there enough to suggest that the work is a little bit insecure, but still demonstrates aspects of that higher level? And of course, we'd be looking to sort of put the mark, 1 or maybe even 2 marks into the slightly higher level, because candidates, they can have sort of inconsistent moments, can't they? But if we think that there is sort of evidence of sort of a higher level, are we looking to award it? We'll be looking at the script A. So that one, as we say, if you've not sort of got access to it right now, if you look on the more, and if we look for resources, you should be able to sort of access it through. I think mine, because I'm presenting, is not letting me do it, but I'm hoping it should be there. They were put in before the meeting. So it's going to be the script A, and we will give everyone sort of some time just to sort of read it and maybe read it through twice and maybe consider a mark for that one. And then after that, we will sort of look at the mark that it received and sort of have a moment thinking about, why that's the mark sort of achieved. And at that point, then we'll take us roughly to our little well-being break moment. So if you can locate your script A, if you haven't got access from the earlier pack, it is in the Zoom resources. So it's under the resources tab, and there's also the mark scheme. You don't need to worry so much about the descriptive content for now. We're mainly looking at the marking grid, which should be on page 15, but might be on page 16. Sort of midway through the mark scheme, it's the generic marking grid with the performance indicators, level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'll give everyone just a moment to sort of locate that one. I'll see if I can just share the top of it just so that people can see that they're on the right script, but it should just be A or B. So hopefully we've got the right one, and then we'll move through. So if we want to take just 5 minutes with that one, it doesn't sound like a huge amount of time. And then as you finish, if you want to pause it a level, or if you're feeling like saying, actually, I think there's a mark, and we don't need sort of huge amount of detailed comment, but maybe a comment as to where you arrived with that. So, what was the feature or characteristic that made you place it there? So certainly a level, and maybe an indicative word of why you feel it's that level, or a short comment. So we don't need a paragraph, we just need sort of a comment. And if you're feeling like a mark, you can certainly add a mark as well, and we'll do feedback in that in 5 minutes. For those of you doing the rover, it's a rover. And just as and when you're ready, if you want to, in the chat box, suggest a level and just even a short comment on what would guide you to that level. For information, this response was sort of type, so if you have some issues with spelling of words or terms, some could be attributed to typo, but it was typed originally. And if we're thinking it meets characteristics of a particular level, question we might just want to ask ourselves is there enough to take it just over that borderline into the level above? Again, it might help to think about those headline descriptors. If you're thinking it's a level 3, clear and relevant, do you see any evidence of discrimination in terms of looking at meaning, any evidence of trying to look at a nuance? And yes, just in terms of what to post into chat, L3, L4, L5, whichever level, a brief comment, it can be a phrase just on maybe what guided you there. And if you feel you have the mark in mind, you could pop a mark on. And I said we'll reveal sort of the mark and the chief examiner's comments now in a moment. I do appreciate we're not giving you very much time to sort of to read the response. So thank you. So we're beginning to get some responses in now. So we'll have a look at some of these. So we've got some takers for just into level 4. We've got, again, I think similarly, so Andy, you've gone just into 4. Rebecca, you're saying again, we're seeing those elements. You're suggesting we've got some elements of 3, some elements of 4. We have some, so say maybe possibly top 4. We're definitely beginning to see suggestion that we think there's some 4 in there. We're possibly not 100% confident because maybe there are some flaws or some issues. And thank you for my early brave responders. You're right with that. Okay, so if we have a look and if we look and see where this result was placed. Okay, so this one, it is sustained in terms of students and sort of how they're working. But that is kind of, as we said, balanced with the sense that there are some flaws. We mustn't be negative, but there are flaws, and the flaws are indicative. We do have some discrimination, and there is some control. Although there are some errors in terms of how the idea is expressed. The word some creeps in. We've got some evidence of nuance, some evidence of discrimination, some detail coming in links to context, and there's relative developments. There is a bit of balance, there is a bit of control. This response, those of you who said you felt 3 with some 4, you're absolutely on the nose. It did get in the level 4, 16 to 20 range. However, sort of given some of the issues, it did just get in there. So those of you who felt it just tipped over the line, it got 16. We certainly wouldn't have an issue with it being given a 17, but because that would sort of be within parameters. So the idea that yes, there was definitely evidence of some 4 in there, but equally weighed by moments in the response which remained clear and relevant. So although there's 4 and there's definitely some examples that can be drawn, we have to do that sort of best fit. And those of you who said it got just enough for a 4, it ended up getting 16. I think if we were looking at in a marking session, we probably wouldn't argue with a 17 either. So you're looking 16, 17, you're looking at that lower end of 4. Obviously, we're saying that there's some aspects of 3. For those who felt it did sort of show that 4, what would we advise this candidate if we were trying to push them, challenge them, and direct them towards a 5? So if we take that possibly some of the level 3 features were to do with typos or exam situation, what could we say to them to develop those discriminating aspects and take them to a 5? If we to give them one piece of advice, what can we say to a student who's showing some level four, and we're thinking about how do we refine that to a five? Are we thinking about, is it range of references that are being approached? Is it to do with nuance and depth? You know, are we looking for more depth? Are we looking for more critical engagement? Are we looking for balance? Do we feel that there was maybe an imbalance with the AOs? So what would maybe our first piece of advice be if we were trying to sort of push them even further? If we were trying to say getting a four to a five? Yeah, I think this is it, isn't it? It's the balance, it's the depth. And to be honest, this is quite a good response and quite an indicative response of how candidates may occasionally perform under pressure. You know, we see those little glimpses of something that could be really focused and really critical, but it doesn't maybe go where you want it to go. And then equally, we see maybe a few little errors, or we see a few moments where the candidate really doesn't get beyond clearly relevant. So it's one of those answers, isn't it? It's one of those inconsistent answers. And if we had a little bit more consistency, we'd be solidly in four, and then we'd be pushing in, as you say, to that higher level. And it's that sense of, yes, that's a good piece of advice, actually, and possibly, less is more in this case, isn't it? So if they'd actually considered taking, two characters and focus on them in more depth, and giving them that opportunity to show their evaluative skills. And that can be the danger, can't it? Candidates want to show you everything they can do, and then they may sort of skate the surface a little bit. But we do still award the fact there was some discrimination there. There's some good choices made, and it could move. It could move higher with a little bit of crafting, with a little bit of refining. Subtlety, yes, Bradley. It's that subtlety and nuance. It's that level five characteristic that we want, isn't it? It's that idea of taking and teasing and thinking about how, we've zoomed in, but we can also then zoom out and look at that bigger picture and link across between craft and purpose and theme. So thank you sort of for participation with that. You'll be pleased to hear, just at our point of our short well-being break. So if you do sort of have a need to step away, or get yourself sort of a hot or cold drink, we can reconvene. It's not a terribly long break, but if we say that we all reconvene at sort of just after 10 past the hour. You don't need to log out, you could just leave yourself there, but do feel free to step away, get yourself away from the screen, get yourself a drink or a snack, and we'll pick it up again just after 10 past. Thank you so much for those helpful comments. And I'll move the screen actually back up to where people were giving some advice about different performances of those texts, because we had a few useful suggestions of versions that the people liked of particular plays. Twelfth Night, we've got the Globe and the National. There's another one on YouTube we have with Helen Hunt and Paul Rudd. I don't think I've seen that one. We've got there's that Gillian Anderson streetcar, which I think is National Theatre. We've got then Faustus. You've mentioned that you've been able to sort of possibly, you could possibly look for versions. I know some of the text, but we just don't have as many options, unfortunately, do we? It's kind of what's out there. What's Yes, sometimes YouTube can help. Sometimes the streaming of these services can be really useful as well. I will see you all back here at just past 10 past, and thank you for your time and attention. Hi, Mark. We're just about to start again. Just another 60 seconds. Pop the video up. Hey, welcome back, everyone. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a very brief break before we press on. Just as we say, moving into section B, that reminder from part one, where yes, we obviously explore our context with our plays, but because that's not the specific focus of the section A scheme, that you were using your AO3 context there as sort of a form of AO5, critical interpretation, whereas with section B, we are looking at the four AOs of the paper. So we are looking at each of these in turn. And it is that thing to remember just in terms of, the weighting of how students, focus on the two separate plays. Obviously it's almost impossible to sort of teach those texts like Othello, for example, without that notion of context. But in section A, you're looking to use it as a way into a critical interpretation or forming your own critical opinion. In part B, we still want to do that, but we have that sense of this explicit expression of our understanding of the significance and influence. So it's just a slightly different focus in terms of what you do with the context in section B. We're more explicit in terms of sort of saying that this has the sort of significance and influence separately to the sense of the different interpretations and how they sort of guide our reading or guide our understanding. So our current choices, and they've been that for a while now, we've got a Raisin in the Sun, a streetcar named Desire, which is still sort of highly popular. Death of a Salesman is picking up speed, and we do see some Top Girls and some Waiting for Godot. As before, we choose one and have two questions on each text. And we're looking at these questions and we're thinking, as we did before, of sort of how we use the question, how we pick up on those key phrases, and how we sort of hook in to elements of the task. And as we said with section A, the same rule applies. We have this statement or steer, which is guiding or giving the student some ways into the text. And then we have the task itself, in the light of this statement, explore presentation of X, usually is sort of the format that we take. So they're invited to, and we're very happy. And in fact, we would like to see, an exploration of a wide range of features of that presentation of theme. But the steer is there to help students get that hook, get that way in. And it gives them a chance to evaluate a particular critical opinion. And that is something to bear in mind for AO5 for those candidates that we have who are maybe somewhat restricted, or if they're working in that lower range. If they are responding to the statement, we're assessing it, and obviously it is at that quite restricted level, but we can assess that as a response to a critical interpretation. So the statement itself is an interpretation that they're invited to respond to. Obviously, for students working at sort of level 3, level 4, level 5, we would expect sort of more explicit reference to external sources and works or readings that they've covered on their course. But it is for those students who are sort of maybe potentially finding aspects of the course challenging. It is sort of reminding them of where they are achieving. And if they do sort of respond to the statement, they are showing evidence of AO5. Obviously we'd say that may well end up being at a restricted level, but it is indicating that some AO5 is there for those students who are, as we say, maybe finding, this aspect of integrating performance difficult. Mainly, we'll use it across all levels, but then students will be bringing their own interpretations to the table as well. So we have the popular response, the death of a salesman. Here it's sort of, as we said, gaining ground on streetcar over time, and we've got some streetcar coming later. We have this idea of characterization and the sense of longing for the respect of others, but ultimately failed to achieve it. So two elements that we could hook into here. We have this sense of desire or motivation, as we've seen with some earlier questions, and then this idea of endings, and conclusions. So in terms of the tragic arc, is it sort of key to the tragic downfall of Willy Loman that he ultimately fails to sort of gain that respect from his children, from the outside world, and the idea of, how is that presented? Looking then at option B, question 16, we have again a question of the world that is being given to us. So number 16 is maybe more explicit in terms of inviting you to sort of discuss AO3. It's the sense of what is the dramatic world, and then the sense again that not just a portrayal of honesty, but an evaluative judgment that it's believed that it is rare and often unwelcome. And again, candidates, they don't have to be in agreement with the statement. They can sort of work against it. They can work through to what extent they can present their own views with confidence early in the response. But we have this sense that we've got the two parts. We've got the comments and then we've got the task. And the task is usually explore playwright's presentation of theme XYZ. So that's usually sort of a fairly standard format. And we can even invite candidates to sort of construct their own questions or sort of build questions up based on their revision. So thinking about the honesty question. So we're looking at the honesty and thinking about the how, stagecraft front and center where possible. Where students limit themselves to level 2 or at best low level 3 is where they focus in on honesty merely as a theme. So they're looking at what is being presented, but they never move as far as how it's being presented. So it's just something for those mid-range candidates to really get them to bear it in mind. When we see a word like honesty, our brains are thinking theme, but that how is so important, the presentation, the dramatic presentation. So where we see evidence of honesty, dishonesty, what techniques are being used by the playwright at that point. And then looking at the question, the statement, we have the idea of discussion or personal response to the sense of the world of the play. So it's clearly a cruel world, and some candidates write quite well about the sort of historical context and how, Willy's life fits into that. And the idea, of the common man and the modern tragedy versus conventional tragedy. And once again, we remind them they're addressing the second part, but by all means, it can be informed by the first. The idea of the opener and the closer, it can seem quite counterintuitive, but the sense that if the candidates are doing some revision work or planning work or doing a short activity in a lesson, the opening line can be a sort of a bold response where they state their position in relation to the task. And then likewise, a closing line could be sort of an ultimate close of argument. And then it seems quite strange to focus on open and close and not in between. But it's this idea of thinking, if that was your beginning and your end, and then how are you going to signpost your way through that? What journey are you going to take to get from each of those lines? And then that could get them to focus in the body paragraphs on how that honesty is being presented. Are they going to look at particular elements of stagecraft? Are they going to think about, is there a pairing of a particular technique and the introduction of a particular theme? What could they adopt or avoid in terms of responding to the question? We already mentioned this idea of not getting too bogged down in what is honest or what is dishonest. And certainly at that lower range, candidates sometimes tend to describe a scene or an example. They'll spend a lot of time putting their example in context and then less time actually analysing how it's presented, and sometimes missing out the how, sometimes missing out the idea of, how is the playwright achieving it. In terms of plan, candidates work in many ways. Some prefer bullet point lists, some like using visual organisers. And again, that can be something explored before we get sort of to exam season, thinking about getting students to think about what works for them and active planning. We mentioned before using things like the mark scheme and sort of adding to them or critiquing them. They could also do those mind maps or visual organisers. And for those students who prefer to make lists, they could think about would they use headings. There is an aspect where occasionally students do fall back on some of those formats that they've used in earlier examination series. And while it's not incorrect as such. We're not actively discouraging them. They can sometimes constrain them. So the candidates who sort of stick with things like that, like the petals, etc., they do sometimes keep themselves roped in by that. So while it can be a useful technique for a student who needs some guidance, we'd advise them to sort of move beyond that as they're working and start to think about maybe addressing things via the AOs. So maybe using AO aspects to structure, or within particularly AO2, really focusing in on the how. Could they bring out maybe 3 aspects of staging if that's something that they want to do? So it's finding a way that works, and you might even have different candidates in the same group, working in different ways. The idea of position. Now, on one hand, we have candidates who may restate a question, and that's not an issue in itself, but it's not going to move them forward. The best candidates, without presenting a fully formed thesis, they're quite clear in their position in relation to either the question or the steer that's being sort of presented to them. So they're quite clear in sort of telling the examiner, this is my view on this. So if it were a question on appearance and reality, for example, thinking back and referring to the terms of the task or using synonyms is to be advised. That's not being repetitive. That's actually sort of staying on task. The sense of some students do use a linear model, and that can become maybe a little bit limiting in a drama. The answer may not be as sophisticated. It could be more effective or more useful to focus or structure around those narrative or dramatic techniques. So it may be that the idea of the dialogue or the interaction between certain characters could be looked at. If, for example, you're doing Williams staging, well, I think Miller as well, actually, the staging is quite prominently working as a narrative function as well. So you may look at that in sort of a separate section. And the idea that we're moving beyond word level. We need a plan, and possibly we're planning in relation to AO2, and then obviously we'd ideally like AO3 and AO5 to be interwoven within the response, but certainly candidates need to make sure that they're there. And for our candidates who find it challenging, in the interim, they may begin with sort of sections with those and then work towards that interweaving, that interleaving. Looking now at Streetcar, which is still by far and away one of the most popular texts, we've got the same format: statement followed by task. We've got this question on Blanche initially, at once deeply intolerant and extremely vulnerable. So there we're giving students, 2 aspects that we might consider of the character that we could evaluate and unpin and think of nuances, and then look at, how. And then the question is presentation of complexities. So the candidate is quite a free rein there, actually, to think about the different elements or facets of Blanche's character, and where those are shown and how those are shown. And the best responses, they will combine work on dialogue with the work on plastic theatre. So they will look at not just the costuming, but they'll look at the sort of expressionism in the lighting. They'll look at the music and how it impacts her at different points. She's maybe being overwhelmed by the blues. And then we've got the music sort of associated with Stanley. And then likewise, the Varvosian polka is sort of her mind, her trauma, etc. And looking at that alongside sort of certain moments of dialogue, and coming to a form of conclusion about not just telling us that there are complexities, but then maybe considering what is the playwright doing there. So what do we think is sort of the effect of those complexities and in terms of audience response. Certainly candidates usually have quite a wealth of information for their AO3 and AO5 here, and the warning would be to resist the urge to tell us everything they know and to keep it focused on the question. So we certainly say that students are often well prepared, and they do know a number of useful and relevant things about both context and sort of critical readings. And it's that idea of them, if they want to get a level 4, a level 5, we're looking at words there like discrimination to get to level 4, and then that sense of assured critical evaluation at level 5. And what they want to do is not give us maybe necessarily everything they know, but use relevant AO3 and AO5 to expand upon and support their own ideas. Number 18, we have the characters who find it difficult to tell the truth. And that one, perhaps the candidate maybe needs to tell us a little bit about, their interpretation of truth. And then this sense of not just moments of truth telling, but the dramatic impact. So you're looking there at moments of revelation and the aftermath of these revelations. And that's where we can get into that nitty gritty of staging. So it's not simply, here's a terrible moment when the truth comes out. But, if we think about the scene with Blanche and Mitch towards the end of the play, the tearing of the lantern, you've got lots of work you can do with props and symbolism and plastic theatre, as well as the immediate interaction between the characters. So there's sort of a wealth of material you could draw on there. And it is that keyword dramatic impact that's just been put in to remind the students really focus on the staging, not just say the element, because if they just focus on the idea of truth telling, you may go down the route of treating the character as real people. And that's the big one to avoid. Students do still slip into it from time to time. They're trying to take us through a character's journey, and we do sometimes get sections where the character is being discussed as a real person, and we don't see it as much as we used to, but it still does crop up, even in answers that go on to sort of gain high levels. We do get the odd slip, and it's this idea that we must constantly think of writer's craft, the dramatist's craft. So they are presenting us this character of Blanche, for example, and they're using Blanche to portray this world, to portray these themes, and so on. And if we keep the writer foregrounded and the dramatic presentation foregrounded, then hopefully they'll avoid that. But as you say, we do see with some questions it does slip in again time to time, and it's not such an issue if there's the occasional slip, but it's where maybe a middle performing candidate sometimes can get a little bit bogged down. So if we took question 18, for example, they may spend such a time telling us about a particular moment where truth is told or truth is revealed that we lose sight of the playwright, or we lose sight of the play as play. So it's just that little warning bell, ask them to reread the paragraphs and just check that they're not drifting off into talking about the character as though they sort of exist outside the world of the text. And looking at possible approaches candidates may have, we mentioned with that previous candidate, and a number of people who commented in the chat box noticed that what the previous candidate had done was they were a little bit in balance, and therefore they didn't sort of maybe achieve as much as they could have achieved. The sense of this second section, the presentation of, we must keep reminding them which bit is the actual question. So the bit of the question is exploring presentation or exploring dramatic impact. The steer is there as a help, not a hindrance. So the steer is there to get them to sort of develop a personal response, but do stay focused on the part B, the bit that says explore presentation of or dramatic impact of X, and that is the task itself. There are points where the sense of arguing against or feeling that there are stronger characteristics. So you may introduce other words, or the candidate may introduce other words and suggest that there's a stronger argument for them. Could there be a broader approach? Could there be a way of where you look at that particular performance in context, and it may involve discussing another character, or thinking about, is there potential foil or a contrast with another character and language and setting and staging. So bringing home a key point and thinking carefully about the first part, not necessarily agreeing, not being afraid to disagree, and the idea of not blanket agreement. The first statement is put there to encourage candidates to develop nuance. It's put there to encourage them to question elements of it, and to encourage them to sort of develop a to what extent style of evaluation. And it actually can sometimes bring out some quite interestingly different perspectives. It's not twisting the question on its head, but candidates sometimes take a statement, still address the explore part correctly, and they actually sort of reverse the statement, present a very strong reason for why they completely disagree. So thinking about keyword activities, getting students to reevaluate words that if they look at too quickly, they may interpret in a straightforward way. Ask them about highlighting words in a question that they think need to be considered in greater depth, and ask them to sort of identify a potential problem with a word. So, say, for example, the student chose the word difficult, there could be an argument against, maybe that they do not find it difficult to sort of be dishonest. And then this should ideally lead them into their AO5 in a wonderful world as they unpick and begin to sort of consider the nuances of the steers, they might then introduce some of their prior work on critical interpretations. And it can be their own response that's being developed through the range of approaches they've taken in class, or it can be more explicitly, a confident ranging through given approaches from critical texts and sort of critical academic discourse. With context and the sense of critical context, so again, we're getting this overlap, thinking about when it's relevant. So particularly with Williams, we get some very good work here. We do get some students who think, particularly thinking about how he sort of positions himself as Blanche and in what way would that be possible. But we equally do get some students still who will give us sort of a paragraph about Williams and his sister and not really relate it closely to a particular task. So they'll have some information about his life, but they're not always entirely sure what to do with it. So it is that idea of keeping it related to text and task. There have been some really good responses on that initial reaction to Stanley's assault. There's been some very mature responses that are, wonderful is not the right word, but the idea that you can read that the candidate has taken a really nuanced and sensitive approach to the sense of different audiences and place and time. And thinking then, we mentioned those words in question 18 and the idea of difficult. And even at the basic level, we did say there is a possibility for a student to gain marks as long as they're engaging with that first statement. So at the lower end, the least that we'd like them to do is sort of engage with some of those words in that statement. Thinking about context of reception, we don't need sort of an exhaustive description, but we do maybe need to think about where things are relevant, where the staging, and particularly with something like Streetcar, that does come in, film adaptations where they are also relevant. And then, as we say, our literary critics or our other critical analysis that has happened over time. Showing their own understanding and their own creative and critical response is awarded. The sense of drama being seen in different ways by different audiences, the idea of how the attitudes and values have also changed. And this can be a lot for students, it's a lot for them to juggle. So it's this idea of thinking about approaches. So some centres do advise candidates to possibly look at their draft responses and actually get them to self-identify, say in a particular paragraph, where they feel they are hitting those assessment objectives. And if you do that, if you use sort of a set of highlighters and colour code or do it on the computer with the digital copy, they can very quickly see if there is an AO that is lacking. So it can feel a bit of a strange activity, but it can be quite a useful one to do once or twice, because a student may feel that they're definitely including context or critical interpretation. But if you ask them to actually go through and highlight and pinpoint, they may see that, for example, they've got an AO3 gap or an AO5 gap. So it can be a useful one to do from time to time, not to unnerve them, but to actually get them to think about, have they got the coverage of the context? So AO1 and AO2, we hope would be happening most of the time, but it's looking for and asking them actually to go back through their own work and identify, say, okay, show me where you've made a relevant comment about context and it's sort of associated with the question and associated with the criticism. We have sort of series of resources beyond using academic gist or etc. We can look at where we have had for example here Arthur Miller talking about his own career, and that can be found on YouTube. Candidates can be sent to do research on particular aspects. So again, it might be a feedback activity where candidates are given a particular critical response and then they're asked to sort of teach it to the rest of the group. You can look at, again, this idea of the quizzing and role playing. So the research is one element. Possible obstacles can be class size, so we don't always sort of have larger groups. It can also be, candidates feeling somewhat shy in front of each other. And also increasingly in a time of AI, how reliable is what they've researched. And one other way is actually to give them those extracts, those gobbets first, and then ask them to do something with them, ask them to do some active critical engagement, and then move through. There are ways, if a student's happy to record themselves and not to be standing in front. And we can also get people to sort of do a fact-checking exercise and make it non-threatening, you sort of make it fun but useful, if we sort of fact-check across each other's work. We do want to encourage independent learning because the point is to sort of prepare people for that next stage, that next level. We do want a variety of types of material and variety of access as well. So the sense that possibly where we have had records of an artist and their thoughts, that can be useful. And then obviously we've got academia and oracy, it gives a nice chance for them to sort of talk. So let's have a think about just in chat, how do centres do this? So do you tend to send candidates on an open research task? Do you sort of maybe present them with something like a mini anthology or mini extracts, possibly already pre-selected, which give maybe varying interpretations of a particular aspect or of the text? Um, do you have them doing some form of group task on this? um, or just to sort of share ideas here. If people just pop into chat, and this is going across both, I suppose, AO3 and AO5. If we lean in a little bit more to AO5 here, because I know that was a question earlier on. So in terms of how you address it, is it sort of kept as a separate activity? Is it something that's done before you get into the text, or is it something that you do as you proceed through different elements of your play? Is it something where a candidate is sent to work completely independently, or do you give them some materials and then ask them to do something with those materials? Um, do you sort of get the students to engage in sort of oral discussion and debate, or critique the critics? Just for a few moments, if people want to just quickly share, just make a few comments on how you've been trying to or working through addressing AO5 for the post 1900 text. And obviously that will sort of apply across to other units. But I think that's it, isn't it, Bradley? We're putting a lot in their hands. We sort of say, off you go. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so, Rebecca. It's particularly certain texts, there's a wealth, and sometimes maybe it can be quite overwhelming, the information that we have out. Anna, you've mentioned that idea of the pre-selected anthology is maybe a way to guide them through, so getting them done. And yes, maybe before entering the text, so it's done like a pre-reading. Is there anyone who sort of approaches it as particular themes, as particular issues arise during the text? Yes, yes, Rebecca, again, explicit instruction that they do need a guideline, don't they? Key perspectives, Marcus. So you've said about the key perspective and then asked them to look at those critics within that. The master Google Doc, it's a way, isn't it? And it's a way that actually would be non-threatening for you, so that they get a chance to sort of contribute without feeling they're on the spot, So, and I think that's an important point you raise at the end of your comment, a roundtable discussion of each's value. We need them to be critical about the material that they find, don't we? Certainly we can guide them with some material that we give them, but when they're off on their own, we need them to know the difference between something that's maybe going to be, high quality material and relying on AI. Yes, so Anna and Mark, you take similar responses, very similar approaches. Has anyone had the opposite problem? Has anyone found with their particular set text that actually it's struggled to sort of find sort of high quality material at a level that the candidates can deal with? I know sometimes some candidates can become quite swamped or overwhelmed by sort of university level or JSTOR. Is there anyone who's found that it's been tricky with the text that they're working with? Yeah, the response to the critic, that's key as well. If we do just, Mark's made a really important point here. Um, if we see it's a student's response to the critic, that's where we're starting to get up to high 4 and 5. We're showing the student is using the critic to guide their own critical interpretation. And that's what we'd love to see, isn't it? That's what we're hoping for. So that they're not just kind of including it, they're actually saying something about their view, about this critical view, or in this case, what it adds to or how it helps them deal with the particular question and task. So it's giving them an illumination point, isn't it? And I think that idea of the using them. So the idea of a pre-selected booklet, and then obviously you will have some students, won't you? You will have some confident candidates who can move beyond. And then, criticizing the critics, as we call it, the idea of knowing about these opinions and knowing what might be useful and what might not be so useful. And yeah, bringing them in to shape the discussion. Yeah, so Bradley, that idea that actually when it's relevant to that particular part of the play can be good as well, so that they can see this is a useful aspect to consider when we're looking at this particular point. So, there are still ways of doing it. We can give them, as we said, the anthology, looking at particular named approaches. Depending on your text, I was going to say eco-critical theory, we're not always getting there with certain texts that we're studying. But the idea even of structuralism, we sometimes overlook that, but that sense of the structure and aspects of structuralism and how that might help us interpret or understand. And once again, this sense that there's a two-step here, isn't there? We have to try and bring these points across, and then we have to try and see how useful they are to the student and their own opinion. So it's constantly sort of a two-step process. We don't expect people to cover everything. So first of all, please be aware, we don't want you to spend hours or your candidates to spend hours digging deep into everything that's out there. That idea of the mini anthology can be really useful, can be really helpful. And even as we said, those so-called snippets or gobbets and really get then the students to maybe work in a group and really unpick or really sort of explore them. Google Scholar, it's there, but we've already caveated that things like Google Scholar and JSTOR, they're fine and they're certainly good with those students who are working at that level, but they may need a little bit of filtering from the teacher. The e-magazine, it's a subscription, but they do sort of bring it to the candidate level very well. Yeah, the books points. AI we'll try and cover because it's still controversial. Our film and TV, we've discussed this in part one of the meeting, haven't we? That we mustn't neglect those as possible AO5. We can cover two areas of those depending on how we use them. Those people who do speak of a specific staging as an interpretation, we've seen some really good answers doing that in the past. Someone who's adopted an evaluation approach and using it as a sort of a critical way of looking at things. So it still was felt that this is still the area that needs fine tuning. Students, I think, sometimes fear it, or sometimes, sort of learn a set of quotes about sort of particular critics. And we have that little feeling sometimes it's a little bit bolt on. The best students, they're really confident with what they're trying to say, and they refer to the critic almost in passing, but only to sort of get across their own point. So they have that sort of confidence where they take a point of view and then say, well, I think this could be applied. However, X, Y, Z, so they're quite happy to sort of argue quite happily for and against it. But it's where candidates, I think, that they lack the confidence, don't they? And it's the sense that, getting them to sort of gain that confidence and engaging with the question at that lower end as well, including challenging it. Our literary criticism to develop the line of argument. So particularly if a candidate has come across a critical approach that they feel that really helps explore the text in a meaningful way, they could bring it into their argument for a particular task. Taking the entire text from a particularly literary perspective can be useful if the candidate, again, has confidence in that area. And then for those who've read widely and using those mini anthologies, potentially a particular image offering more than one interpretation and suggesting that there is sort of an ambiguity and it's a meaningful ambiguity. I wouldn't necessarily say, Anna, that they use first person. We'd avoid first person. When we say their own critical opinion, it's kind of evident in the response. So we're looking for that academic voice, but without the first person I. So say they bring in their critic and they state the position of the critic. they can imply their response by, if they're arguing against, say, however, it seems clear from the thematic use of this that this is not the case. So we don't want sort of I believe or my opinion, but we're getting their belief or their opinion, if you see what I mean, through their essay. So does that make sense? It's their opinion, but we don't really want to see the first person, but it's implied. They're putting the critic in and then through their answer. Yeah, absolutely. No, I know, because that's what happens when you do say it to the student, isn't it? They sort of think, oh, will I say I? And you're like, no, but we know it's you. We know which bits are the critic and which bits are yourself. And this is where a cross-reference through to some of the other units can be helpful too. So you can sort of get them to reference other times when they're having to sort of state that opinion through. And as we said, it's frustrating because we know they know and we know they've been prepared, but I think there is just that little level of fear when it comes to AO5. And sometimes, we'll try and solve it as best we can, but the candidates do sort of need to just be able to just tell us what they think. Yeah, this word that we said bolts on, we'll try not to just stick it at the end of an argument. We don't see that very often, but sometimes we see someone running out of time and thinking, oops, AO5, and then we get sort of an AO5 paragraph at the very end. And so we're obviously going to try and avoid that. Text-specific resources, there should be some information and some critical references on the website. So if we go through and if you go to, it'll be under teaching and learning resources as opposed to assessment resources. And I think as well, if you look through, I think it was sent the Getting Started book, it has some recommendations about approaches that you could take. And if you think about how the sort of on the UK spec with the Shakespeare anthology, that can give a really good model or guide. So on the paper where there is an anthology available, which is there's a comedy anthology and a tragedy anthology, it gives a nice idea of how you might set your own class anthology out. The extracts aren't particularly long, they're a couple of pages each, and they kind of cover different critical approaches. So, yes, we're on international A level, but if you also look on the what was called the home spec, if you look on the other page for English literature on Edexcel, it can be a really good guide of how to go about making your own anthology. And in the case of Othello, I think you can actually just use the Othello. So there are some of the plays that cross over both qualifications, so you can use those. But there should be some, Rebecca, if you look in the teaching and learning resources tab, there should be some information in there. There should be some critical snippets and extracts. And as I said, it can be worth visiting the UK site. I know it sounds strange, but particularly for some of those Shakespeares, they're on both qualifications. And in fact, they've done the work for you. You can just sort of look at the Othello section or I don't think Twelfth Night's on there, but definitely you've got Othello. The idea of digging deep, most students did manage to get a short critical statement into their answer. So it says here, for example, someone took a critical point that they knew or remembered or revised. They put it into their own thesis at the beginning, and then they went through and actually developed their line of argument. So right from the start, they made it really clear to us, I know what I'm doing with AO5. They sort of made a response to the question. They stated one particular critical view, and then they clearly stated their viewpoint on it, and then say, right, I'm going to go on and argue. And obviously they'd refer to some other AO5 throughout the response, but it's a really handy way of definitely showing us that you're in control of that. So it's that sense that, we're not box ticking, but if a candidate can manage to take a meaningful quote from a critic and actually incorporate that into their primary response in the introduction, they're showing us that they're on the right track. They're showing us that they're knowing what they're doing and they're in control of what they're doing. So similarly now, as we look at section B, we did this with part A. This time we're looking at the script B. So we've got a complete answer to number 17, and we're going to just try and place it in the appropriate level. And I think this time, because sometimes it can help actually to sort of have a read through it, just so we can sometimes spot the strength and then also spot the issues that we have. So I'll just try and bring that one up for us now. Just bear with me. And in the meantime, while I'm doing that, you might wish to just dig out your mark scheme and take yourself to sort of part B of the mark scheme. Again, we're interested in the performance grid. So we're not too worried about the indicative content. We're looking at the sort of the overall performance. Just bring this up now. I've got it, and it is a streetcar named Desire. So just bear with me, and I'll share the screen. Okay, what I will do, because I've not got it here, it's the Edexcel website, and when you go through qualifications in the drop down, instead of picking the the international A level, if you just pick the GCE A level, and the page will look very similar to what you look at when you're looking online at your Edexcel page for international, and that will be, it actually is sort of a tragedy anthology. So at the end of the session, we will have the web link up on the screen. We have it on one of the PowerPoint slides. So it's the Edexcel website, and if you go through subjects, when you pick English literature, you'll have a series of choices, and instead of choosing international A level, if you just choose A level English literature, that will take you to the UK spec, and the anthology will be in there as well. So I will sort of show that as we go. Yeah, so it's Edexcel qualifications, A level. At GCE, it's A level, okay? So it's not GCSE, it's GCE. You'll get it if you type A level in here. So it's the tragedy anthology. And for those of you doing comedy, there's a comedy anthology as well. So some of them, you'll have generic critical interpretations of genre, which might prove useful too. I will go back through that when we do the last set of slides as well, just to make sure that everyone knows where they're going with that one. So this one is streetcar. It is typed, and we do forgive students that the odd loss of the capital letter because they are typing at speed. So we're going to have a look at this one, and as before, we're going to think about where we place it. So in many ways, Streetcar Named Desire is an exploration of the human condition and an interpretation of our changing worlds. So they're addressing the changing worlds part of the steer. Through the character of Blanche, she expresses struggles he personally faced, while also highlighting universal struggles faced by many due to postmodernism in our newly fixated society. To Williams, Blanche symbolises the mental challenge he faced through his life, such as alcoholism, and uses her as a mouthpiece to critique the contemporary audiences of the 1940s. It could be said phenomenal success of his play can be attributed to his exploration of taboo topics, feared to be discussed by many. His exploration of such adds depth to the play, allowing it to have greater impact on his audience. And we can see here that, we definitely have some AO3 references, and the student's careful to immediately link it through to Blanche. It's a question about Blanche. So we have it phrased, to Williams, Blanche symbolises mental challenges he faced through his life. So it's not bolt on as such, that they're making an immediate statement of how, his life context may be linked to our interpretation of Blanche. There's a suggestion at this point about what they feel Williams is doing, his intentions. And there is even a sort of sense of the idea of critical reception in that word taboo. So we sometimes have, these words and judgments showing that the candidate has a grasp of reception, a grasp of critical interpretation. And I'll read a little bit, and then I'll leave everyone to read the rest. We'll not to read out everything. So William portrays Blanche's character to be completely delusional and out of touch with reality. He illustrates it through a development of the character. At the beginning, she's painted to be a sophisticated Southern belle longing to be reunited with her sister. However, as the play develops, it invites to explore Blanche's true character, as she turns out to be the complete opposite. The contrast William creates between the illusion and reality of the character of Blanche enhances the idea of Blanche as a complex character. So they're showing that they've awareness of the key terms, and they're returning to the term of the question. The Southern belle persona she attempts to grasp onto suggests her choice of costume, so staging. First introduced to the audience, Blanche is dressed in the white suit with the earrings of pearl, we believe. The use of colour white connotes the idea of purity and innocence. Through her outfit choices, Blanche attempts to establish authority rooted in her privilege. Her obsessive desire to maintain looks could be an attempt to conceal the past as a prostitute. Her desperation to do so is a result of the hard reality she's attempting to avoid. She fears being condemned as she finds herself in a new urban atmosphere. She understands her limitations as a woman and the consequences she'd have to face as a result of past conditions, because women in the 1940s were judged if they attempted to explore sexuality and gain respect based off lack of special experience. Williams also highlighted women's economical dependence on men in the 1940s. Blanche's creation of the so-called character Charlotte Huntley only emphasises her desire for financial stability, but feeds in her delusion and desire to escape. presenting her as a complex character. Blanche states he's got oil wells in Texas spouting money. Shep's pockets in the quotation serve as a metaphor for financial status, ultimately what she admires about him. She desires materialistic things in life in the sense that they create a fabricated version of herself. Spouting suggests an amount that's uncontrollable. I mean, perhaps here they're going a little bit word level, but they are trying to engage with the text. Blanche goes on to say, honey, would I be here if the man weren't married? She's yearning to find again an opinion to live a lavish and luxurious life if Shep wasn't married. It's ironic because at the point in the play, the audience is aware she has no other option. But Stella references her honey suggested to exploit the authority, as women in the 1940s are deprived from asserting dominance. She sees it as a chance to do so, uses it to her advantage. Ultimately, the image she tries to convey of herself is much different from the one portrayed to the audience by Williams. This emphasizes complexities as well as symbolizing her eternal conflict in this ever conflict. Using Shep to feed her desire further suggests she's complex. It then moves through Williams's normative determinism and symbolism. So we have some analysis again of crafting. We have the bathing and the plastic theatre and the Madonna whore concept, and that would begin to look at AO5 actually, because they're referencing the critical concept there. Coming back, they're looking at the polka. So we've got the stagecraft again. Moving through, then we have Blanche's being assertive and how that might cause confusion. The use of setting, and we've got Old South, New South, so we have an understanding of the symbolic setting there. And the sense that her eyes of a contemporary audience. So there's always sort of an awareness of audience and the boundaries of a stereotypical woman. So just give everyone a moment on their own time just to have a look through their script B. And then as before, a couple of minutes, and if you want to sort of posit a level or a reason, and then we'll go through and we'll look at the mark that the answer achieved. You can just pop them in chat when you're ready. Okay, thank you, Bradley. So again, if anyone wants to sort of add thoughts on where this one was placed. Okay, so we've got quite a difference there. We've got a lower 5 to a mid to high 3. If we're feeling there's an area that's maybe less represented, we might want to think about a best fit. So quite a range. If anyone else wants to sort of pop in their thoughts. And I think actually, given that that's sort of quite a wide range, oh, we've got a few more now. Given that that is quite a wide range, we will sort of have a look and we'll see what the piece was sort of ultimately awarded. So we will have a look and see what it was given and why. Thank you, Mark. I do appreciate, and particularly I know that you all are sort of working through some papers this week as well. Thank you, Mark. And I will just say again that you should hopefully be able to find that on the UK one. So have a good day and bye-bye. Thanks very much. Okay, so we'll go through and we'll see. Looking at the points, we're thinking here in terms of this one, it was actually a more solid 4. There were occasional flashes of things that were potentially 5, but given, and that's not sort of to correct those answers that we had sort of a low 5 and someone feeling it was a secure 3. And this was sort of a very up and down response. We know that one of the key areas that was a bit lighter was AO5. I did mention the Madonna horror complex as potentially being something we could award, but we didn't see very much AO5 apart from that. However, we certainly had embedded AO3, so that seemed to run throughout the response. AO1 and AO2, sometimes the argument wasn't sort of steered in a fully controlled way, but we felt that overall, I'm agreeing with everybody here, really. There were very brief flashes of 5, but not enough to reach 5. There were moments where we might have to say 3 because we really didn't have very much AO5. But overall, there was a degree of control. There was some discrimination, particularly in how they used their AO3 to inform their reading. So they sort of drove with the AO3, but clearly knew the play and knew some aspects of plastic theatre. We did see that little bit of word level creeping in that we talked about earlier. But looking at the piece of work, weighing up the strengths and the areas for development, this piece ended up achieving the 19. And we can see clearly that the big gap would have been their AO5, which is why we've been talking about it today, and maybe just that little bit more control to keep it consistent. But we think that, the strengths sort of maybe outweighed the weaknesses, and a fair position was a 19. AO5, very brief, and then we had to look through, maybe give some credit, but certainly other pieces did sort of show that flash of critical evaluation, and therefore a fair mark was felt to be 19 to sort of show the students' performance overall. So technical focus, being more specific, and the idea of the different staging, so that sense of that. And then looking at these strategies that we sort of see, it's the idea of sort of exploring that text. So at level 4, they know what they're looking for, but they're thinking about how it connects to those contexts of critical approaches. So they're going further than sort of that word work or sort of looking just at the technique on the surface. Level 5, they have a secure methodology and a secure discussion. So they're able to be sustained. And that's sometimes they say that response there just didn't quite get to the 5 because of that gap. We know that you're doing your course now, so we'll not really think about whether it's modular or linear, but that's something maybe to think about. In terms of support, I mentioned this earlier on. Obviously, we're on the international A level, and there are plenty of teaching and learning resources on this page. But with the particular example of Othello, which crosses over, you might also find additional work on what's called the homepage as well. So between the two, on the international A level, there are teaching and learning resources, and there are some nice documents. The Getting Started document gives some information about how to work in AO3 and AO5. And then if you want some extra, just pop across onto the sort of sister site, if you like. And because of the slight difference in the units, there's also some material on the Othello text in particular in the tragedy anthology. And there's some generic information on tragedy and comedy that might help you approach particular plays. So there is a lot on there, and there's a lot of sort of useful information, and it's being updated all of the time. So there's sort of many good things on there that we can work our way through, and they're divided up. So we've got our past papers, but also look at the teaching and learning materials section, the sort of booklets going on all the time. And we can see here, and there's also past training, which can be quite useful if you've missed a session or if it's something from a few years back. It can still be of use to you. Results Plus, some skills subscribe to. Equally, Exam Wizard, where you can kind of format and create new questions. One of the most useful things is the access to your own scripts, so getting that access back and giving you information and detailed information of choices that your students made in terms of which question, and also sort of individual performance at those levels. There are various packs available and various textbooks, although it's not necessarily, as we said, just to stay with our Edexcel resources. You know, we can use those general resources out there. A good point of contact is subject support, and that is at teachingenglish@pearson.com, and it's Claire Hallivan, which is very helpful, and she can help you if, for example, you're saying, you know, could we develop a resource on this? She's very open to the idea of developing additional resources to support particular texts or particular levels of attainment that students want to focus on. There is the Pearson Professional Development Academy, and that is sort of a free online resource, and it allows us to kind of just bolster or revise some of our work on the units. And you can sign up and sort of do it at your leisure. Basically, that's sort of a set amount of time you can be logged in, and you can work your way through the units in your own time. And it gives you some exam insights on particular qualifications. Newsletters as well. And then just as we go, thank you. It's been a whistle-stop tour, and I'm aware that for some of you it's exam week, and I'm aware also that everyone's very busy. If you do have any sort of pressing questions or pressing requests that you'd like me to forward, if you want to sort of pop that into the chat box now. I do thank you all for being here today at such a busy time. And I would say thank you very much for attending, and do have a lovely day wherever you are, and enjoy the rest of your day. So thanks to everybody, and I'm looking forward to seeing those soon, those of you who are sort of coming to the following meetings. So thank you, and goodbye, and I'll just keep an eye on the chat box.